Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the National Zoning Atlas's latest research brief, covering a really great topic, sea level rise and zoning. And we're featuring today research from the Urban Institute entitled Zoned into Risk Toward a Climate Resilient Index Development for housing development. Our speakers today, so I'm Sarah Bronin, the founder of the National Zoning Atlas. Next slide. Our speakers today include Andrew Rumbach, who is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, and Will Curran-Groome, who is a research associate at the Urban Institute. I've had the pleasure of working with them on this brief over the last few months, and I just want to express my appreciation to them for all of their insights and for finding new ways to use our zoning data. For those of you who are not familiar with our project, next slide, we focus on the topic of zoning, which is local land use regulation that dictates what can be built where, and because of that has huge implications on how the entire country, or at least the part of the country that's zoned, is shaped. Zoning regulates land uses. It regulates buildings and structures. It regulates lots and the way that lots can be developed. And it does so at the scale of districts. So you'll hear in the presentation a lot about zoning codes, zoning districts. And it's important to know that the way local governments regulate is through geographies, through maps. So again, these are adopted by local jurisdictions. And as you'll see on the next slide, we have started to cover much of the country. Our URL for the atlas itself, for the public-facing portion, is at zoningatlas.org/atlas. Everywhere that you see on this map is a jurisdiction or a local government, mostly local governments, that have enacted zoning, or in the case of the gray areas, have not enacted zoning. So you'll see, for example, in Texas and New Mexico, lots of gray because those jurisdictions, mostly counties, have chosen not to zone. In other places, California, Arizona, Nevada, the parts of New England that we've reviewed, we've not only determined that these places have zoning, but we've read the zoning codes, mapped each and every district, and delineated on the map certain types of regulations. And so just again, by way of background on the next slide, the map itself is there for your use. There is a public-facing portion of the map. It enables at a very basic level for us to see how housing, in particular, the topic of today's conversation, is regulated, allowed, or prohibited by different local governments. This area that we just showed as an example here, the city of New Rochelle and surrounding areas in Westchester County, you can see at a glimpse where single-family housing is allowed as of right, which is everywhere that's shown in purple within New Rochelle and outside of it. And then on the right-hand side, where 4 or more families housing is allowed as of right. You can see that New Rochelle has actually done a lot of work in its downtown and its train station areas. It too, up in New York, the New York area is along water, and we are soon to release a report on those areas as well, and sea level rise and the zoning there. So just please, I encourage you to look at the map itself, to play around with it, and see if you can discern some patterns in your own communities or in places that you're familiar with that are up on the map. And so just on the last slide, the National Zoning Atlas, what we aim to do is to digitize, demystify, and democratize information about the country's zoning codes. We are about 20% done. We continue to work in lots of jurisdictions around the country. I thank our analysts who have contributed to the work that went into the underlying zoning information that the Urban Institute has used in its brief. And then on the next slide, there's lots of different ways to be in touch with us. So with that basic background about the National Zoning Atlas, what our map shows and how it might be used by you, I want to turn it over to our Urban Institute partners so that they can outline exactly how they've used the Atlas in much deeper research. Andy, go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for having us, everyone at the National Zoning Atlas. I'm Andy Rumbach. I am a senior fellow at Urban, as Sarah said. And for some of you may know me from my previous life, where I was a professor of urban and regional planning and of land use planning at Texas A&M University and the University of Colorado, Denver. So really excited to share this research brief that was recently published at Urban, along with my colleagues, including Will Curran-Groome, who's here to present with me today, talking about the beginning of a project that's very much evolving, that looks at this question of how our zoning codes relate to our ability to adapt to climate change. And so I'm going to talk about some of the sort of background and context and the motivations for the project, and then Will is going to dive into the brief itself, which, while we do focus on a jurisdiction, Mobile, Alabama, really it's about beginning to understand the data and tools necessary to do the kind of analysis we want to do in order to see if we can better leverage our zoning codes for climate resilience. So, Will, next slide, please. So I think, you know, the context for us is very much rooted in this question of increasing losses due to climate change, whether that's climate disasters like the total economic damage shown here as a share of GDP from disasters, but there's other costs associated with climate as well. Everything from additional stress on infrastructure and housing to impacts on different economies and industries. And so we're really interested in this question of you know, how can local governments and local places better plan for and adapt to climate change that's coming, regardless of what anyone is saying in the federal government. It's real, it's happening at the local level, and jurisdictions are trying to address it in all kinds of different ways. Next slide, please. And so, you know, it's easy to look at a big bar chart and to look at GDP share of disasters, but in reality, it's pictures like this that really contextualize climate change in our communities. This is in Phoenix last summer after they had the longest stretch of 100+ days of temperature. They had over 90 straight days of 115 degrees or more in Phoenix, which shattered all-time records. And this is going to be probably one of the coolest summers they have for the rest of human history. Next slide, please. Or it's scenes like this. This is after the Marshall Fire in Colorado, which was a New Year's Eve wildfire in Colorado, which are not words that we would have thought of as going together recently, but this is a fire that burned down over 1,200 homes within the matter of a few hours outside of Denver, and caused not only the direct impact on a lot of different people's lives, including those who were killed, but also long-term impacts to local economies and to the housing markets in these areas. Next slide, please. And so, as I said before, climate change is happening, and you know, we've always suffered from disasters, and we'll talk more about that. There's been a long effort on behalf of really smart land use planners to try to help people make the connection more strongly between land use planning and disasters. This goes well back into the 1950s. Some of the very original work on land use planning and on the promulgation of things like floodplain regulations came out of this exact observation, that the way we treat land development through our land use codes has a direct impact on the disasters we suffer. But the reality is also that the climate is changing and these events are becoming more frequent and severe. And so there's an urgency to this problem that has always existed, but is a sort of an additional edge of urgency now and going into the next decade or two, where the situation is going to get significantly worse. Next slide, please. And then also to turn from the problem to some of the hopeful signs out there. This is from the Yale program, the Climate Change Communication Program at Yale, which does some of the best public opinion polling on climate change as a public policy issue. And this is surveying adults in the U.S. who think that global warming will harm future generations. And what's really important about this map is there's only a few counties left in the entire United States where less than half of people believe that this statement is true. The public's opinion on global warming and on climate change has shifted significantly. Now, people are quite divided on what we do about it, but people's recognition of it being real, being a problem, and being something that future generations will need to worry about has changed remarkably just in the last couple of decades. And every year we see a growing consensus around this. It's no longer the case where we have large parts of the country that don't think that climate change is a real issue. In fact, most places, rural, urban, conservative, liberal, believe that climate change is real and believe that we need to do something about it. Next slide, please. So this is for a brief moment, step into the sort of wonky. Yeah, I'm a disaster planner. We need a better name for ourselves, but we're folks within planning who think about hazards, disasters, climate change, and we really think about what communities need to do to prepare for them or to recover after them in order to be more healthy, more safe, more resilient. And at a very conceptual level, this is not an equation, but this is a conceptual framework. We think about risk to climate change and to disasters, the likelihood that we're going to suffer from these events. We think about it as having sort of three pieces that come together and overlap. So one are the hazards we experience. If I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., we're thinking about things like extreme heat. We're thinking about things like the very occasional hurricane that might hit us. But depending on where you are, you're going to have a different hazards profile. We're also thinking about exposure, right? There's certain parts of our communities are exposed to those hazards and other places are not. So if you live in a place with a lot of flooding, most likely some parts of your community are exposed to those floods. They're the areas that are lower lying or that are not protected by levees, but other places are not exposed. And so exposure is another key piece of this. You can have a natural hazard that happens, but if nothing is exposed to it, it doesn't become a disaster. And then finally, we have the concept of vulnerability, which is just that certain people, certain buildings, certain social systems, economic systems are more likely to suffer harm from these hazards and disasters, and therefore they're more vulnerable. And so when you put all of these three pieces together, you get what we think of as risk. That's, again, that likelihood that we're going to suffer harm from those events in the future. And therefore, the way to reduce risk is to try to reduce hazards, reduce vulnerability, or reduce exposure. So Will, next slide, please. And you can just put all the words up on the slide. So here's the, zoning addresses all three parts of risk. And that's what I think the sort of first step towards zoning is a really powerful tool for addressing risk. We can reduce hazards, by example, by not building into wild and urban interface areas and creating more fuel for fire to spread. Or we can limit the impact of development in floodplains so that we don't create additional flooding downstream. Or we can plan for more green in our cities, therefore bringing down urban heat island effect and bringing down the hazard of high heat. Similarly, we can reduce exposure, right? We could stop development from happening in hazardous places, or we can try to concentrate development and infrastructure in less hazardous places. And then finally, we can also reduce vulnerability. And we can especially reduce vulnerability of the stuff that we put in the way of hazards. We can do things like we already do, for example, that if you build in a floodplain, you may have to build your building higher, or you may have to build it out of certain materials to better withstand the effects of a flood. So zoning touches on all aspects of risk reduction. And yet, next slide, please. When you actually look into the world of emergency management, you see that land use is one of the least used options for addressing risk in the United States. This is a study from Ward Lyles and Phil Burke and others in North Carolina from a number of years ago. They were looking at hazard mitigation plans from across the country. These are the mandated plans that you have to have in order to access certain disaster recovery funds. If you look across all of the actions that are laid out in hazard mitigation plans, how to reduce the risk of hazards, which is what hazard mitigation is, you see that preventative land use is the least used by far of all different categories of interventions. And there's a lot of different complicated reasons for that. But one of them is just the fact that a lot of people historically, planners have not thought a ton about hazards and emergency managers have not thought a ton about planning. And that is changing radically in just the last decade. I was telling Sarah last week we visited one of her classes that when I was a student at Cornell 15 or 20 years ago, there weren't any classes on climate change or disasters at that time. Today, it's a very different world. So there's a huge opportunity here to bring these two communities closer together, and that's exactly what we're trying to do through this project. Next slide. So to wrap up my section and to hand it over to Will, what we see is a really core challenge and need emerging right now. We have a ton of development in high-risk areas in the United States, and we're putting more stuff there all the time, which is partly what explains that big increase in the economic costs of disasters. That's the number one driver, even beyond climate change, is the amount of development we put in the way of hazards is one of the number one issues driving the economic losses from disasters. We also know that, reducing development in hazardous areas means that we have to accommodate development elsewhere. We are growing as a country. We need more housing. We need more economic drivers. We need more X, Y, and Z. We need to accommodate that stuff in safer places, and therefore meeting the community's needs for multiple things at once. Yes, safety is important to people, but so is having access to affordable housing, and so is having access to good jobs. And so we need to balance these different needs together. And then finally, zoning is a really important part of that. And there's a ton of research to show that places that leverage their zoning do better after disasters. But there's a lot of disconnect that we see in the world. There's a disconnect in the capabilities and tools that places have to assess the relationship between their zoning and their risk. How do the two relate to one another? There's not a lot of great conversations happening between planners and emergency managers at this level, talking about individual development levels. There's trade-offs that have to happen, and we need tools to think about how can we do win-win? How can we accomplish our housing goals, but also our safety and resiliency goals? And then lastly, there's a really important political momentum that's happening right now with a huge amount of credit to the YIMBY movement. All of a sudden it's cool to focus on zoning, and that's great. There's those of us in urban planning are happy to see it. And this is also an opportunity to focus on the question of zoning and climate, and in ways that we don't think they've done much of it as of yet. And so finally, and this is my very last point, we need data in order to drive these reforms. We can't just rely on the good argument that these things are related or that they matter to one another. In order to make real decisions on the ground, we need good data to inform those decisions, and that's where the need for this kind of tool comes in. And so with that, I want to pass it over to Will, who's going to introduce the idea of the Climate Resilient Development Index and then talk about the particulars.
Thanks, Andy. So I'll try and kind of provide a little bit of background building on what Andy was talking about for kind of how we undertook this project, walk through our approach, touch on the limitations, but also kind of opportunities and next steps that we're hoping to build on following on this kind of first pilot implementation, and then open it up for discussion and questions. So we came to the project with a couple of kind of motivating questions. The first was kind of understanding, to Andy's earlier point, how zoning was interacting with hazards, with risk. So understanding how the current zoning of climate safe areas was or wasn't addressing kind of the capacity for housing. And so we were thinking about capacity and needs for housing in safe areas from a couple of different angles. One was population growth, just kind of natural growth of population within an area. And the other is in-migration or growth from households moving to a community from outside. And then the second, this was kind of more where we focused with this initial implementation. We really wanted to understand how zone capacity in relatively hazard safe areas was sufficient or insufficient to accommodate households that might want to or need to relocate from areas that are at risk from a hazard. And so we really wanted to make sure that we were understanding as well some of the spatial components of how that was playing out across jurisdictions, across regions. So to understand how that might be intersecting with demographic trends and things like where lower income households are located, where renter households are located, where households of color are located, and to understand kind of the variation in climate risk and zone capacity for housing in relation to some of those demographic characteristics. So we received a fairly small amount of internal funding from Urban to kind of undertake this first study. And Andy kind of prefaced this, but really our goal was to conceptually implement this in a pilot location and to work through some of the methods and kind of feasibility and approach that we might be able to then expand on and build out further in subsequent implementations. So we decided to kind of pilot the process and tool in Mobile County, Alabama. Mobile County has pretty significant flood risk profile. It's located along the Gulf Coast. A lot of Mobile City, which is kind of the core central city in Mobile County, but many other cities in the county as well, and parts of the county are immediately along the coast. And there's also inland flood risk. So we decided to pilot it, kind of looking at Mobile County as a somewhat coherent housing market. So looking both at the city of Mobile and then other municipalities and this county, unincorporated parts of the county as well. And so our goal really to kind of prototype this quantitative methodology, understand the data sources and how we could put them together to understand how zoning and housing capacity, existing housing on the ground, and we're focused on flood risk in this initial implementation because that was the primary kind of hazard impact in that area, and how those all were kind of relating to one another and how we could operationalize that with different data sources. And I'll add a caveat now, and if folks have a chance to read through the brief, you'll see that a lot of the brief is really focused on kind of setting up the approach and focusing on the motivation for this work, and less so on the Mobile specific findings. And I think I would caution everyone that that these are pretty illustrative. I would take any of our discrete findings with a grain of salt or a few grains of salt. And I think we're really hopeful that this is a promising first step toward kind of extending on these methods and making them more robust and thinking about how we put them into conversation with local stakeholders to really understand other dimensions that we weren't able to model here quantitatively. So at a really high level, walk through kind of the data approach and probably not spend too much time on this. This is documented reasonably well in our brief, and definitely invite questions later on if there are particularities of it that are of interest. But I mentioned earlier, we wanted to bring together a bunch of these kind of disparate data sources to operationalize some of those core motivating questions. So we were pulling sociodemographic data from the American Community Survey. That was at the census tract level to try to understand kind of variation across neighborhoods within Mobile County. We were leveraging data from the National Zoning Atlas to understand what the zoning characteristics were. I know Sarah touched on this earlier as well, but those zoning characteristics are things like, can you build a single family detached house on this property, or can you build 3 or more units on this property? But then also things like, are there setbacks, and what are the setbacks required on a parcel, or what's the floor area ratio? So we were trying to integrate all of those different dimensions of zoning to understand potential development on parcels. We accessed parcel data from the Mobile County Revenue Commission, I think, which provided some really important information both about parcel dimensions, but then about kind of the value that the county assessed different parcels at that we used later in the process. We pulled flood hazard data from a data set from NOAA, and that integrated a few different kind of sources of measuring flood risk. And so we took those data, we were combining them with our parcel and zoning and demographic data, and kind of aggregating everything up to the parcel level, which was our fundamental unit of analysis. And that gave us attributes about zoning, flood hazards, tract sociodemographics, tract level housing characteristics. And what we were really hoping to get from parcel data, but wasn't available in Mobile, was the number of existing residential units. So we accessed a data set from FEMA, which I think is called USA Structures, which provides building structure footprints. And so we kind of intersected that with our parcel level data and then worked with our tract data to estimate the number of residential units on each parcel. And that moving over under estimated existing development, that was kind of that process there, trying to understand using parcel characteristics, using building footprints, using demographic data, how many structures, how many residential units were on parcels already. That's one half of the equation. The other core half was kind of estimating the zoning envelope. So understanding what could legally be built per the zoning ordinance on a given parcel. And so I was mentioning, we were trying to account for things like floor area ratio, for parking requirements, for setbacks, for the total number of units that could be built on a parcel, things like that. We tried to iterate to calculate the maximum number of residential units that could legally be built per the zoning envelope. And then taking that zoning envelope and subtracting the number of existing residential units gave us the zone development capacity. And then we were kind of breaking that out by whether the parcel and the structures or units on the parcel were at flood risk or not at flood risk. And those kind of gave us a relocation need. So assuming somewhat simplistically that units on parcels at flood risk, they might need to relocate to other areas within the jurisdiction or within the broader Mobile area. And then relocation capacity was untapped zoned capacity on parcels that weren't at flood risk. Just a quick overview of some of the characteristics of the region, building on some of those data sets that I was referencing on the previous slide. We see, interestingly and not entirely unsurprisingly, that single-family residential zoning dominates across most of the areas in the county that are zoned. We can see that in lots of Mobile, but also other jurisdictions as well that leverage their zoning powers. Sarah was talking earlier about how there are many communities, particularly in certain areas, that don't actually use their zoning authority, even though they might be delegated it from the state. And that was the case in Mobile County. So all of the, excluding the pink colors, all of the kind of grayish beige color here are areas that don't have zoning. So a lot of that is not an unincorporated county, but there are a handful of incorporated jurisdictions as well that haven't chosen to take advantage of their zoning authority. And then here, just talking quickly through the flood risk profile of the county, we can see a lot of the coastal areas have really significant, extensive flood risk, but also the flood risk kind of moves inward, and you can see it kind of following rivers and other inland bodies of water as well. And I'd say, just in terms of really visually looking at the overlap there between zoning and flood risk, I think one area to call out is downtown Mobile, which is right on the coast almost. Bay of Mobile there allows for a decent amount of 3+ family housing or relatively dense zoning, and then is pretty significantly overlapping with flood risk. And the same is true kind of heading northward from Mobile up along kind of the wetlands into the bay there. There's significant kind of zoned housing, zoning and flood risk intersection. So to just touch on really quickly a couple of the things that we looked at, we found at a really high level that zoning accommodates relocation, kind of looking at Mobile County as a whole. There's like a surplus zone capacity on relatively low risk parcels relative to the number of housing units that exist on parcels that are at higher risk. But we can also see, kind of looking at the second column in this table here under zoned housing units, that there's a good amount of zoned housing capacity on parcels that are at higher risk, which is to say that the zoning ordinance theoretically is allowing for additional development of a significant number of units on parcels that are still at flood risk. We wanted to understand, kind of moving a little bit further just from zone capacity. So thinking about zone capacity is like the legally allowed amount of development that theoretically could occur per the zoning ordinance. We wanted to understand a little bit about how that might interact with market dynamics and actual demand and market feasibility of developing housing. I think that's a major limitation that we really proxied in probably the most simplistic way here, just given resource constraints, and I think is something we're really interested in building out further in subsequent iterations of this project. But we had a few kind of simple scenarios under that feasible development capacity header there in the table. One is our baseline scenario, where we take our total zoned capacities, the legal amount of housing that could be built, and adjust it, saying basically that parcels that already have a significant amount of development on them, we don't think that they're likely to see really significant additional development, just based on kind of the cost feasibility of a tear down and then a rebuild on a lot of those parcels. So that's our baseline estimate there. We see the total kind of number of units, both at lower risk and at higher risk, or lower in that baseline scenario. And then we go explore a couple of other more constrained scenarios, the top quintile tracts and the top decile tracts, where we're looking just at the development potential of parcels in tracts that have the highest housing costs, which we're using as a proxy for the idea where we think there might be more demand and more likelihood for additional development, developers taking greater advantage of the zone capacity in those tracts where there's more housing demand and potentially more profitability. So that's a very quick glimpse of our findings, and I think sets up a lot of the next steps and opportunities. There was a lot we would have liked to do and didn't have the resources and time to totally investigate. So just to touch on a few of those, and we kind of describe those as well in the brief in greater detail. But I think one thing we're really excited about is to explore how to integrate additional hazards into our approach. So we were really focused on flood hazard in the Mobile case, which I think is pretty relevant. But looking at other communities, other housing markets in other areas of the country, it could be wildfire risk, it could be a combination of a bunch of different hazards. So thinking about how we could integrate that into some of our analyses. There was a great piece Andy was talking about earlier about kind of vulnerability and thinking about, for example, how structures are being built, even if they are built on parcels that are flood risk. So I think another opportunity there is to think about kind of our assumption was that households on at-risk parcels might want to relocate, but understanding how different characteristics of things like building codes, flood control ordinances, how those might impact development and the likelihood that households would relocate versus invest in site level mitigation or something like that. I touched on this really briefly earlier, but really thinking about kind of the market demand and how that interacts with zoning. We know that the zoning ordinance doesn't create development, it allows for development. And so there has to be that combination of market demand and market feasibility on a given parcel in combination with allowed development per the zoning ordinance for there to be actual new development. And so I think that's something that we're excited to kind of build out further. And I think a piece of that is both being able to better model what we think the market looks like and what the feasibility of development on a parcel might be, but then also some of those characteristics that Andy was touching on, but quality characteristics that we might want to integrate with our understanding of flood risk. So things like access to jobs, access to transportation, access to healthcare and food and schools, all of those things to provide a more kind of multi-dimensional picture of not just thinking about whether there's capacity to support households who might relocate from areas that are at risk, but whether there's capacity in areas that have other amenities that are desirable where we want to support additional development. And I think one piece of that we hope to build out is modeling policy reforms in areas. So thinking about what it would look like to implement different zoning reforms and how that future state might compare to the status quo zoning ordinance. So things like if we were to upgrade all of the single family zones to single family plus ADUs, how would that change the capacity in flood risk or flood safe areas, things like that. And then I think the last and probably most important piece that I'll touch on really quickly is just this was not really engaged with local stakeholders in Mobile. It was much more a quantitative exercise to iterate a prototype, but bringing this into conversation with local stakeholders and kind of navigating the policy reform and all the process that goes into that is probably a central goal for future steps. Andy, invite you to chime in with any last thoughts. Otherwise, maybe we can turn to discussion and conversation. Likewise, Sarah.
Yeah, no, happy to get the conversation and add some additional detail.
Great. So thank you guys so much for that. Do connect with Urban, by the way, at their QR codes and online, sign up for their newsletter. I'll be your advertiser today. And we do have a couple of questions. It looks like a couple were answered. But I'm going to take Paul's question, which is, have you thought about a simpler, more resilient zoning code and land use? So basically a more resilient code that might be a model code that the federal government might endorse when it comes to hazard-prone communities. So have you seen inklings or movements towards a model zoning code, which is what I take the question to be asking? And if you haven't seen anything yet, would you recommend having one just conceptually? Is this something that you think that the federal government might get into a little bit more? Either of you, feel free to chime.
No, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that that's always been the tension. You know, I do a lot of work with FEMA, for example. I help develop their land use planning class for hazard mitigation. And there's always this question of what can the federal government do when, you know, land use authority is very much at the state and mostly at the local level. And so I have not seen any efforts to do like a sort of, you know, you see from like IBHS and a few other organizations that are doing like wildfire certified communities and that kind of, you know, the smart city movement and safe city movements have sort of indicated or hinted at what a code might look like. But I do think that those are the kind of creative options that we need to be thinking about. How do we reduce regulation while also decreasing the costs of disasters? And it requires a willing partner at the local level ultimately, but I think there's a lot of communities, especially smaller communities, that would really benefit from a starting place. You know, we don't get into many of the important details here, but not only are a lot of places zoning codes the product of a lot of different generations of decision makers kind of piling decisions on top of one another, there's also a ton of past discriminatory decision making within zoning codes. And so, you know, there's a ton of research, and you can look in your own community to find it, where we put a lot of uses in more hazardous areas in the past that now house a lot of people of color. They house people living in mobile home parks. They house people living in sort of industrial job supporting housing that's often sort of naturally occurring affordable housing. So there's a lot of inequities that need to be redressed also. So it's not only about I guess the point is to say is that a model code does need to recognize that we often need to start from scratch, and these problems are not going to solve themselves overnight. It's probably going to be a generational change. And so starting from somewhere, many jurisdictions don't feel like they have that capacity because doing a complete rewrite of their code is really difficult for them. They're always trying to incrementally change it. And so I do think there's been a growing movement to sort of rethink these from the bottom up, and templated or model codes would make a ton of sense for lowering the bar to entry for a lot of these places.
And I'll just add here that one of the things that the National Zoning Atlas is enabling is standardizing information about individual zoning districts. And through that process, we've been able to identify a few types of characteristics that do facilitate housing. I wouldn't say that any single local jurisdiction has managed all of its risks through zoning, but we do see some models for that. If you go to the atlas itself, we have chosen a FEMA flood layer to show on the map that you can toggle on and off. And we are likely to put up a wildland urban interface layer as well. There's wildfire risk, extreme drought, heat. There are a whole bunch of other risk type layers that we could put on our map. But as a starting point, those are the couple that we're starting with right now. And as far as a model code, one of the reasons that our structured data might help lend itself to that later is because we're seeing how so many different communities organize their codes. It's possible that as an outgrowth of our project, we'll work with other researchers to try to develop something depending on the risk, because dealing with extreme drought is different and might require, for example, landscape related provisions or watering provisions than dealing with sea level rise is another example. Anyway, there's a few great questions in the chat.
So I had one more.
Oh, sure.
I put it as an answer to another question, but I just wanted to say one project that I worked on for years is it's planning for hazards, land use solutions for Colorado. And it's focused on Colorado, but there's a ton of stuff that's broadly applicable, but that's specifically around model codes and language around different land use tools for hazard mitigation. And, point is there's a ton of really great examples out there of different jurisdictions that have used their zoning code to manage risk. But as Sarah in the National Zoning Atlas, sort of the entire theory of the case here is this stuff is often fragmented. There's not a lot of ability to share between places, and different places do it differently. And so there's just a ton of opportunity for learning and copying what others are doing. There's no need to recreate things in many places. The solutions are already pretty well known.
Thanks for that. And Brian has a couple of questions, but I think I'm going to just drop the conversation we were just having and pitch over to you the question about data quality for risks. So the question is, what are your perspectives on data quality for risks that act as inputs to your assessment? So your fire data, your flood data, and does data quality contribute to uncertainty on top of the climate scenarios, which of course differ from, they are constantly changing. So how does data quality and the sort of just the general dynamics of climate change influence how accurate assessments like these will be both now and in the future?
It's a great question. I think data quality is always a huge challenge. I think we liked in a lot of ways the data set that we happen to use for this implementation from NOAA because it integrated, it was a composite hazard layer for flood risk. So it compiled a bunch of different operationalizations of flood risk. And we basically said, if any of these data sets that NOAA has compiled reflect flood risk for this parcel, then we're going to assume that there's flood risk at this parcel. That could lead to an overstatement of the parcels that are at risk. But I think a broader challenge is, to your point, like we would have loved to be able to model what this looks like under different climate change scenarios. I think we weren't able to find a great source of data for pluvial flood risk. So we're really just looking at sea level rise and riverine flooding. And there was some really great recent research and longstanding research about some of the challenges with estimating pluvial flood risk, for example. And I think there were some parallel conversations about wildfire risk and other types of hazard risk that pose concerns. And I think folks have made really important criticisms about how much we can rely on some of these models at really fine scales. So I think that's something that we will likely continue to grapple with and think about how to both try to quantify and visualize and contextualize uncertainty in the models, and then also trying to find data sets that do a better job of kind of comprehensively treating some of these different types of risk. Andy, any thoughts on your end on that front?
Yeah, no, it is a great question. I do think on the one hand, I endorse what Will said. I think this is always a challenge, and this is a challenge in hazard planning more generally, is that we tend to have good data on floods because we have the National Flood Insurance Program, which requires that we map flood risk and therefore has created the actual incentive and money to map flood risk. And then we have, from there, you start to have falls off in terms of data quality, wildfires and landslides and other things. That being said, even if we were zoning to our current risk, we would be doing much better than we're doing elsewhere. So many jurisdictions have to have legally defensible approaches to hazards and therefore have a fairly good idea of what their wildfire, flood, landslide, avalanche, a few other risks are. And so the data sets at a local level are pretty good. If you zoom out to the national level, you're going to start to see spottiness in that data coverage. But for many, many places, we have a very solid foundation of hazard data that we can use in this model. And then looking out into future climate, I think that the models get better and better all the time. And one of the techniques that we're using is doing exploratory scenario planning, where we're able to show, using two different emissions pathways, what are the likely impacts, what are the potential land use implications, and then you try to develop policies that are good for both scenarios so that you're robust. Regardless of what actually happens with climate change, you're robust to either of those paths. And so that's another kind of community engagement technique that we're using. But again, many jurisdictions are already doing this and are fairly comfortable with the climate models that they've adopted at a state or local level.
Thank you for that. There are more questions than we'll have to answer in the next 1 minute, but I'm going to pick up on DJ's question here. And the question is, has there been any engagement with the insurance industry on this research? I see great potential for using it to enrich actuarial risk models and for the vast trove of insurance industry data to enrich this research. From the National Zoning Atlas's perspective, we've certainly been contacted by insurance companies who are interested in reviewing how we collect information, and but we haven't really engaged with any in any meaningful way yet, just because we're still in the process of collecting data. So if your question is about the zoning collection of data, yes, I do think that there's a lot of interest, or should be a lot of interest as well with the insurance industry, and not just the property and casualty insurers, which I think is the topic today, but also title insurers, because zoning and what can happen on properties can sometimes affect title. Andy and Will, I'll turn it over to you to answer the question with regard to the climate and urban institute perspective. Do you engage with the insurance industry? And I'm sure you do presentations to them, but on the research side.
At this early stage, we have not, but this is very much a goal of ours. The insurance industry is obviously a huge partner they have both a vested financial interest, but also often a sort of a mission interest in reducing risk and increasing safety. And they've been great partners for many states. Like, for example, the Wildfire Partners Program in Colorado is a great example where, voluntary actions to reduce risk on properties led to reductions in insurance rates. So as this project grows and as we make this model more robust, those are the kind of conversations we're looking forward to having, but we're still a little bit early in the process to have engaged with them formally.
Excellent. So thank you for that. And with that, I think we are right at time. So again, thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you to the Urban Institute for a continued partnership with the National Zoning Atlas. This is, I think, the third or fourth co-authored or joint effort report that we've had with you guys. The first with Dr. Rumbach and Will, who presented here today. So thank them in particular. Please do follow us and continue to stay in touch, and our future research briefs will include, actually probably next, a related report out in the New York City region with the Regional Plan Association, another one of our great partners. So with that, have a great day, everybody. Thanks again for joining us today. And thanks, Diana Drogaris, as always, for setting all of this up. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.